I'm going to be making chicken, and I was thinking of doing chicken and noodles, which is a traditional, I think it's been around as long as pasta's been around.
Oh, nice.
They're kind of...
When was pasta invented?
Pasta's been around since pre-Christ.
Yeah.
Before
Before
Jesus.
current era.
before the current era.
I think the Babylonians had a type of pasta. It's been around for a really long time.
Chinese did too.
Yeah, the Chinese and other Asian cultures had pastas.
And stuff like gnocchi has been around. Well, no, not gnocchi.
Not gnocchi, that's potato.
That's
And
right, potatoes. It wouldn't have been around.
potatoes didn't come around until, let's see, they would have hit Italy.
Colombian era.
Weren't they from America? Potatoes?
Yes, potatoes are from Central America?
Yeah, potatoes, tomatoes, and turkeys.
Yes. Yes, although I found out I was wrong because I think we talked about that last time. The turkeys were brought over by Cortez
Yep.
to the Spain, to the Spaniards, and to England much
just-
earlier than I thought.
I just found that out yesterday. That turkeys are a Mayan bird.
Yes. Yes, the death chicken.
The death chicken. The chicken of death. Okay, so, excluding death chickens, what are you doing?
So right now I am kneading bread.
Okay.
Kneading dough. What I am doing is I am making a loaf, and behind you can actually see where the beehive oven is heating up. And you do that by filling it with wood and setting it on fire.
Okay.
So,
So, we got this very lovely stove, and over here we've got this nice warm fire. And even though it is the last day of August, it's actually very cold out today.
it is a little on the chilly side. It's moist though, but what happens is when you're in here with the fire on, it dries it out. And so it doesn't feel as hot inside, which is weird. But what happens is when you're making bread from scratch and you're not using a mix master or a bread machine and you're doing it the old-fashioned way, you have to knead it. And it takes a long time. It takes about 20 minutes once all of your flour has been incorporated.
Okay, and so what did you do to make this tasty looking ball of dough?
So it is 2 cups of better for bread flour, 2 cups of whole wheat flour, and 2 cups of all-purpose flour, which is a very modern recipe that I came up with on my own, although it's similar to billions of other recipes. I have yeast in here, about a tablespoon, a little bit less than a tablespoon of yeast in warm water, warm to the touch, but not hot because you don't want to kill the yeast. Because yeast is actually an animal, it's alive. And so what you do is you put into a big bowl like this one, you put the water, you sprinkle the yeast on top, add in a tablespoon of sugar and a tablespoon of salt and a drizzle of oil.
Okay.
And when I'm at home, I'll use olive oil. I use vegetable oil here. And it just, you can let it sit for a few minutes until it starts to perk and bubble, and you'll actually see little bubbles forming, and that means that your yeast has come to life. And then you slowly start incorporating the flour. And I do a lot of it with a spoon in the bowl just because it's easier. I don't like the shaggy dough on my hands. I'm a princess, what can I say? But I love doing this because the feel of it is so wonderful. And this is so much nicer. My counters at home are this high because they're made for normal human beings, of modern human beings. And so when I'm kneading up here and it messes with my shoulders. This is the correct height for kneading. You should be able to stand and not quite put your hands flat on the table.
Okay, and was that because people were shorter at the time, or?
So yes, people were several inches shorter, and we know that because we have their clothing. I'm 5'1" and a smidgen, and that smidgen's important, just saying. And I have little T-Rex arms. But you look at George Washington, was 5'2".
Wow. He's a tiny little man.
Just a tiny little man with a big figure. The access that we have as modern Americans to good nutrition, even the poorest of the poor in our country have access to better nutrition than our founding fathers had on a regular basis. And that has led to us being larger. The better food you have, the taller you get. And so that's what's been happening.
Wonderful.
Throwback.
Throwback.
I'm perfectly sized for 18th century, so that's good.
Okay. So when we get into historical accuracy as far as bread goes, what would they have done differently with making their bread then? Because we have vegetable oil and olive oil, and I have a feeling that might not made it.
They used olive oil. It's in a lot of the recipe books from the time. Both Hannah Glass, who is from 1747, and Amelia Simmons, who is from 1786 or 82, something like that. They mention olive oil, and so that is something that would have been used. But if I were doing this in the 18th century, I probably would have used either a little bit of beef fat or butter, and most likely butter, because you just need a fat. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. And butter works itself very well in bread, and it tastes yummy. They wouldn't have had yeast, so I have my little container of yeast there. They didn't have dried yeast. They would have either made something called salt rising bread. What they discovered was that if you took, at first they were using a piece of leftover dough, they would take and set it aside in a bit of milk, and the next morning they come out and be all bubbly, and that's because the wild yeast would inhabit it. And we don't know why they called it salt rising, because it has nothing to do with salt. It's possible that what they were doing is you need it to be warm to get that to work, and the salt barrels were fairly warm just by nature, and so we think maybe they put the bowls to sit overnight inside the salt vats, and that's why it's called salt rising bread. But that's a guess by better historians than myself. And so, let me finish this up. Hold on. The ways that you would get yeast back then were either to gather the wild yeast from, like I said earlier on, it would have been leftover dough and a bit of milk. In later periods, they would have used a little bit of, potato with the skin on and a bit of milk. Because potato, the outside of potatoes and apples and other things have wild yeast on them. This is just the oil on the bottom keeps the bread from sticking and also gives it a nice flavor. And again, you could do that with butter too. All right. So the other place you can get wild, or well, not wild, but yeast is from the bottles of beer. So when you make beer, you have barley in it, and on the top of the beer, especially the fast beer that they were making in the colonies, you get something called barley barm, and it's this kind of foamy, gunky looking stuff. That's yeast in amongst the barley. And so you can skim that off the top and actually use that in your bread baking. And it gives it a very interesting flavor, I'm told. I have not tried it yet. One of these days I will do so. But you can make beer batter bread, and that's the same basic idea. You're using the yeast that's in the beer instead of using a dry active yeast. And so if you look historically, you would see that bakeries are usually next to breweries, and that's because they would use the cast off from the breweries to start their bread. So this is gonna just sit until it doubles in size. So right now it's a little bit bigger than fist size.
I like your granola bar too.
So how long does this normally take to rise?
So that really depends on the season and the temperature and the moistness in the air. So today it's a little bit cooler, but we're getting warm in here because we have a fire going. but I do have a breeze coming in the windows and I'm not shutting it down because it feels good. But the level of moisture will help it rise. So I'm gonna put this in a non-breezy place and hopefully in an hour or two, it will have doubled in size. In the winter, it takes longer. In the summer when I was baking in here, it would be half an hour and it would be like eating its way out of the bowl because it really just depends on your temperature. And that's true when I'm baking at home. I have something called a proofing box. So it's a cardboard box that I have a plant mat inside that warms it up to about 70 degrees. Because my house is cold and drafty because it's an old house. And so what you do is you put a little rack on there and you put your dough to rise inside the box and it stops all the breezes and it contains the heat. It's not enough heat to bake it, it's just enough to give the yeast a chance to do its business and make your bread rise.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so it sounds like, or it looks like that baking was a much easier thing to do back then in terms of providing yourself that quantity of food.
So you think about it, in the 1800s, which is the era of the 1700s, which is the era of this fort, 60% of the colonial diet was bread. 60%. So bread was served at every meal, and some meals were just bread. Yeah, you get bread and butter, you get bread and cheese, you'd have stew and bread, you'd have bread. They used bread for thickening things. They used bread as bowls, like trenchers. Bread was ubiquitous. It was a part of everything that they did, and that was true from the lowest backwoodsman up to the highest table in the land. So when you're heating up a bread oven, you need it to get so hot inside that all of the bricks are white hot. So you'll see that there's little bits of brown and black on the inside there. Mm-hmm. When it's ready, that thing will be white.
Shiny white?
Not shiny, but like if you look down in the corners here, you can see where the flames are. It's white there. And you want the whole thing to be like that.
Okay.
And that means it's about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. It's ready for bread when you can put your hand in and hold it there for 5 seconds without burning yourself.
Okay.
But you really want to do it. And you can see there is like a pinhole that helps draw in this, but the smoke comes out in here and there's nothing you can do about it.
I know, but it's barely smoking today.
I know, it's doing really well today. So those are gonna rise until they about double in size. I'm guessing probably about an hour.
Okay, so.
And then they go in the oven, which I just put a little bit more fire in because it went down and the bread isn't quite ready yet. So.
Okay. Well, that's a neat trick. You just separate it into loaves and those loaves rise and...
Yeah, so the recipe that I make makes 2 loaves. And I mean, you can look at ones I baked at home. I pull the modernities out of the way. So this is a loaf that I baked at home and you can see the crumb. And that's exactly the same recipe that I'm using in those loaves right there. Stew is about to come off.
Yay! Bread and stew. Of course, looks very tasty. There's all sorts of beans and carrots and vegetables.
Beans, carrots, parsnips, turnips, mock duck. Duck was eaten at this time. Well, we don't have access to ducks, so I have
Mock duck.
mock duck. And 2 types of beans. I have Great Northern beans and pinto beans, both of which would have been grown around this time.
Wonderful.
Beans were a good portion of the protein that they got around here.
Is there a reason why they would cut the cross on this?
Yeah.
So
Okay,
if you
for
don't
sure.
cut the top of the loaf of bread, it'll split along the side as it bakes. And this way, it just does it the way you want it to.
Okay.
With water, and then there's enough heat stored in the stones to bake the bread.
It's my opinion.
Bake the bean stew.
Okay. And it's in.
And then the second one goes in.
And the this is where they shall stay.
There we go. It'll stay there for about 40 minutes to an hour, and then it'll be ready. And usually about halfway through, I'll turn them around because there are some coals in the back. So what happens is one side will get darker than the other, and so you want to turn it halfway through so it browns evenly on all sides. It's the right sound. Look at
Oh my
that.
gosh, look at that.
Ooh, no scorching at all.
Yeah. And that's got the right sound now. It might be a little underdone, but it's gonna sit out for a few minutes, so it'll finish baking out here.
You
And-
have more loaves going in, or is that?
No, that's it, I'm just doing the two. So you can see why I split it, because otherwise
Has to.
the bread would split itself, and in fact it did and started to separate over here. I didn't split it deep enough.